Welcome everyone to this webinar about ethics for service personnel. And I just want to begin, even before I introduce myself and talk about the topic, just to talk briefly about this concept of ethics. One of the things that happens a lot when people do workshops on or webinars on ethics is some people are immediately offended by it. They say, of course I know what ethics is. I was taught right from wrong growing up, and that's absolutely true. There isn't really going to be anything in this webinar that's going to be a revelation to you in terms of some sort of new concept you didn't really understand. I don't really think that that's the purpose of doing sessions on ethics. That's not really the objective. The objective is really to raise consciousness, to get people to really think about how important it is to do what we've always known is right to do. So I don't think it's really about new information so much as about reminding ourselves again about why it's so important to do the right thing and what a difference it makes. And our hope again is that people, when they're confronted with a situation that requires ethics, will be reminded to make what they know in their heart is really the right choice. So that's kind of the first thing that needs to be said. The second thing I think that's important to say on this topic is that a vast majority, in fact, overwhelming majority of employees in school districts throughout the country, both teachers and service personnel, do the right thing every single day. They know what that is and they do it. So no one is suggesting that we have a rash of unethical behavior going on. That's certainly not the case. But as you'll see as we look at this topic, even though it's a small number of people who don't do the right thing, the impact that their actions can have on the reputation, the view of school districts can be quite significant. So if you're attending this session and saying, this would never be me, I hope you'll come away from that saying, yes, that's true. And in fact, I'm very proud of the fact that I know the right thing to do and I would never not do the right thing. So let me introduce myself. My name is Jeff Olefson from Staff Development Associates, and we're New York based. I guess I probably shouldn't have started an ethics workshop without giving you an honest picture of myself, or certainly if I was going to try to pull this off, pick up someone that was a little bit less well known. So let me actually show you what I do look like. That's me. And I've been doing workshops for service personnel in West Virginia and actually around the country for just about since the regulations came in about 20 years ago. And I did just recently did a kind of looked at how many counties I've actually been to in the state, and I actually figured out there's only about 5 I haven't actually done training for over the years. That's not to say I go to each one each year, but I've certainly been around the state, and I've come to love West Virginia because it's such a beautiful place, and the people are so down to earth. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, what's the definition of ethics? And, if you look up ethics in the dictionary, you're going to get a very kind of dry, kind of processy type definition of what it is. So whenever I'm asked about that question, I always look at a quote from someone who I hold in great high esteem. He just passed away a few years ago, and I'm sure many of you know him because he's certainly a famous, and that was General Norman Schwarzkopf. General Schwarzkopf was once asked the question, what are the two most important things in life? In your role as a general, as a successful general, what do you consider to be the 2 most important things? And what he said these are the 2 most important things to me: doing the right thing and doing what's right. That can often be a challenge. Most people know what the right thing is. The challenge is doing it, especially when doing it would involve doing the harder thing or the more difficult thing, because a lot of times it's easy to just go with the flow. But the characteristics of strength as an individual are about knowing what to do and doing it. He said that is the essence of ethics, And I think if you hold that as your standard, you're going to fare very well in understanding what ethics is in schools. So I think if you're going to delve into the question of ethics, I think it's important to maybe even back up a little further than just this narrow focus on ethics to ask a more fundamental question, and that is, what is your job? Now, it's very interesting. I've been doing a lot of workshops lately, and just recently, I've actually been putting this slide up pretty much with every group that I work with, including many different service personnel units and with teachers, too. What I'll ask them is what is your job? I'm just going to give you an example of a workshop I did recently. It was actually for facilities staff. And I asked the mostly custodians, there were some maintenance folks, what's your job? And I had one custodian say my job was to clean schools. And I had another person who was in maintenance say my job was to fix, and maintain things in schools. So what I said was, well, that is true, but that's actually not your job. That's how you do your job. So, of course, they kind of scratched their heads and, because if you ever been to school and you had a teacher doing this to you, you didn't always like it. What are they really looking for as an answer? So I said, I'm not going to play that game for you with a long time. Let me explain, the difference between how you do your job and what your job is. If you look at what your job is, you're looking at it more broadly. So I suggested that, for example, being a facility staff member, custodial staff or maintenance staff, that the job was to create a safe, secure, and positive environment for kids and for adults who work in the schools. That was one of the jobs. In fact, there were multiple jobs. So that was one. So creating a safe and secure environment for kids. Second job certainly was making sure that that environment was safe. And you could say that comes under the first one. The third item or description of their job was to protect the valuable investment the district had made in its facilities. Because if you look at facilities, just in terms of cost, the millions and millions of dollars that districts have invested in their facilities, maintaining them is very, very important. And when you, just like in your own house, if you let things go into disrepair, not only is it not going to meet the needs of the first example, creating a safe and secure environment, but ultimately it's going to lead to additional costs or expenditures later because things have not been properly maintained. So, and I would say I could even add a fourth one today. In fact, you probably could do a fifth and a sixth if you delve deeper into this question. But one of the areas we looked at was the whole role that facility staff are now playing in terms of being eyes and ears on areas involving security in the schools. And even though some schools may have security staff, in addition, making sure, for example, that doors are locked properly, preventing people from stealing, also preventing intruders from coming in, that also would be part of their role. And then again, just to show you could go even further with this, many custodial staff, because oftentimes kids who bully often will not bully in front of a teacher. They often, and you could say this is somewhat of a left-handed point, they often don't really see custodial staff or service personnel in general as authority figures. So oftentimes they will take these actions in front of, or certainly within view of, a facility staff member, a food service person, or secretary. And so they could become very valuable eyes and ears of information on the potential for bullying, noticing and stamping it out before it worsens. So that's a lot of roles, to play. And what's, I think, significant in all of those roles is that so many of those roles really involve what schools are all about, which is about meeting the needs of children. That ultimately all of our jobs are about meeting the needs of children. And if we're doing things that are supporting the needs of children, then we're doing our job. And if we're doing things that are contrary to the needs of children, then we're really falling short in doing our job. And that's really that schools are all about kids. And so as we look even at the issue of ethics, are we really doing things that serve the interests of kids? So I think that's a question we're going to need to look at. And I would say, again, I want to repeat this. I know it's repeating it over and over again. The vast majority of service personnel are quite dedicated, understand that very well, and would do everything they could to help any kid. That's why they chose the kind of work they do. But that said, I think there are sometimes people can fall short of remembering that. They can focus more on their needs and perhaps put kids second. And so I think that's the first piece of ethics we need to look at. So if we've established the idea that putting the needs of kids first is really what schools are about, what's best for kids, then one of the questions we have to ask is, what does that really require of us as individuals? So I'll give you the simplest example of this. It's really, I didn't put a slide up on this, but I can talk about it. It's a very simple concept, and the concept is out of view, no impact. So what does that mean? Well, there are going to be situations where you may have disagreements with each other. You may have disagreements with your boss. You may be right about those things. Your boss could be wrong and you're right. In fact, most of the time, people who think they are right, actually a lot of times they are right, okay? So you may be right about something, you may be correct about something, but nevertheless, if you being correct about it is going to come by having an impact on kids, then we need to rethink it. So let me just give you, again, I'm not going to only focus on facilities here. I'll give you some other examples, but here's one that just came up recently, again in facilities. Lots of times in facilities, there'll be particular areas. So one custodian's responsible for the first floor or that wing of the building. Somebody else is responsible for a different wing. You had a situation where there was a spill on the floor. A custodian was walking by. It was not his area. He was just passing through. But that spill was on the floor. So the question becomes, should he pick it up? Should he address the spill? Because after all, it's not his area. He's not responsible for that. And the answer under the ethical principle that you put what's best for kids is that you obviously do what? You pick up the spill. Why? Because a child could get hurt. An adult could get hurt. And so even though at that moment it's completely right, it's not your responsibility to clean that up. If you apply, in the sense of that being your area, it is your responsibility if we put the needs of kids first. So the question becomes, what happens if this is happening repeatedly? Because maybe the other employee doesn't do their job well. Okay, so it's happening a lot. Okay, the question is, each time you see it, should you pick up the spill? And the answer is, unfortunately, yes. Every time you see it, you have to pick up the spill. Because each time you see it, that's a unique situation where some kid could get hurt or some adult could get hurt. So you always have to pick up the spill. Now, that does not necessarily mean that if this is a chronic situation that you shouldn't be complaining about it or, and we can certainly in another workshop we'll talk about whether it's best to address it with the employee first or with the supervisor. But I'm suggesting there's a place to complain about that because after all, it is becoming an abusive situation and unfair if you have to be the one that's constantly picking up the slack for someone else. Having said that, though, each time you see it, you really only have one choice if you apply the principle that we put the needs of kids first. And that is each time you see it, no matter what you do, you've got to say, what's best for kids at that moment? So the basic concept is we meet the needs of kids, we meet the needs of stakeholders, then we fight out our battles over our issues. And we have those battles out of view. And what do I mean by out of view? Well, kids shouldn't know if one employee has a dispute with another. Kids shouldn't know if a teacher and a teacher aide don't agree on something in the classroom. Those things should be out of view. And by the way, I had another example of this involving, I could think of lots of examples, involving paras, teacher aides, where there was a situation where the teacher had forgotten she was going to do a math lesson, and she had left her math manipulatives in her car. And she asked the teacher aide if she gave her a key. She asked her if she could go to the car and get the math manipulative. So I asked a group of teacher aides if they thought they should go to the car and get the math manipulatives. After all, doing errands and getting things out of somebody's car is not generally within the job description of a teacher aide, right? The question is, should you do it? And I had asked for a show of hands. You can even ask it in your own room. How many of you think you should do it? Yes or no? I'll give you a second. If you're in a group, and if you're not on your own, you can raise your hand. Should you do it? Let me just tell you what my opinion is on this, and certainly there are opinions on these kinds of things. My opinion is you should do it, and here's why. Because at that moment, what are the kids' needs? They need a lesson in math. And the practical reality is that you can't do the lesson. You can't start the lesson. The teacher can. If you look at what's best for kids, the answer has to be that you let the teacher start the lesson and you get the manipulatives. Now, once again, if this is happening every week, I think that gets to the point where you have to say, hey, you have to take some responsibility for this. I'm not your personal servant. And I think if it's become a situation of abuse, or the person beginning to think that somehow they're entitled to that, I don't think that that's the case. I'm not suggesting that as a service personnel that people can use putting the needs of kids as an excuse to take advantage of other people. But having said that, I think you still have to say, I will address that separate and apart from its impact on kids. I will get the manipulatives, and then perhaps I'll file a complaint or I'll make an objection, etc. But I will always try to put the needs of kids first. So it's a really simple guiding principle in terms of ethics on this. What you basically do is, in response to any situation you face, you ask, okay, what do kids need first? Let's deal with that. Get that out of the way. After all, kids are innocent. They came to school, and schools are for them. Let's deal with their needs first. And then what we'll do is we'll fight it out about our needs. And that is not to suggest that the needs of adults don't matter. It's just a question of order. So what I've often said to staff is, look, let's think about what's best for kids first. And then let's talk about how we can do that in the way that is the easiest, most convenient, most respectful to the adults. Once you flip that around, where you start to put adult needs above kids' needs, that's when you have schools that don't really function effectively and that are ethically wrong, because kids are children, and children deserve adults to have their act together. I think this is a pretty obvious question. It would really surprise me that anyone would not answer that they would not want to be responsible for harming a child. And in fact, just recently I was doing some training for transportation personnel, and we were talking about how horrible a thought it might be that even if we had not done anything wrong, if a child ended up getting injured, say loading or unloading, and this has certainly happened where there's been bus accidents, how that would change the life of the person forever, even if you were not at fault. Just the self-doubt alone would be a horrible thing. Just this notion of not wanting to harm a child is really important. And I think in the most explicit ways, most people, almost everybody, would say they would not want to be responsible for harming a child. Having said that, though, I would say that lots of times people can do things that could harm a child in a very kind of an indirect way. So let me give you an example of that, which people may not always be aware of. We've had situations in school districts where people have stolen money. Just recently I was working with a district, and they had a bookkeeper who was diverting funds from the district and using them for personal use. Now, I'm sure that when she was doing this, and it's hard to get into the mind of somebody who did this. First, it was going on for a long period of time. I'm going to talk about this as an idea that very often people who do unethical things, like stealing, don't begin by stealing lots and lots of money. They often begin by stealing a little bit, and then when they get away with it, they steal a little bit more. And then when they get away with that, they steal a little bit more. And so it tends to be a little bit of a slippery slope, and we'll talk about that more later. But just this notion, this person was actually stealing, a fair amount of money from the district. And of course, as often happens with most thieves, the more often you do it, the more confident you get, the more brazen you get. And that often sets you up to get caught. And in fact, in my own state of New York, we had a superintendent and school business administrator who've been doing this for a bunch of years. They started out small, and by the time they finished, the total of what they had stolen was close to $11 million between the two of them. And it involved a conspiracy involving probably about a half dozen people in the district. So they brought more people in to this conspiracy to steal money. Now, what I want to point out in this is that when this finally breaks, and in almost every case, people are eventually caught. They may not get caught right away, but they will get caught. So what happens at that point is, well, you're thinking, and in some cases they make restitution, so it seems like everything is all well and good now, they make restitution. What I don't think these people appreciate is the incredible impact that that event has on the reputation of the schools. We have a challenge with trust in schools and with public institutions in general because sometimes, as with private sector organizations, they often fail us in terms of ethics. But more with the public sector, it's news. So if something happens in a company, you may never really know about it. But there's a good chance that if you've got a arrest of an employee within a school district, it's going to make the news, it's going to make the school board, people are going to be aware of it. And what happens at that point is that people lose a confidence in the institution. They say, if that person was doing it, how many other people are doing it? So immediately the public trust is lost. And when that public trust is lost, along with it is a lack of confidence and commitment to the schools, which can have an enormous and significant impact down the road for children. Because there may have been strong support to adding programs or adding services or building a new building, and all of a sudden you've got people now who are questioning, well, is there waste and fraud, and they become suspicious of the district. And that has an enormous impact on kids. So when you damage your reputation, certainly the impact on your life is going to be catastrophic. I mean, you may lose your freedom. And districts are quite aggressive. District attorneys and local law enforcement are quite aggressive because they really want to send a message. You're stealing from everyone. It's one thing to steal from one person. When you steal from all of us, you may think that's less important. But the viewpoint of a lot of people in elected offices, when you steal from everyone, that's even worse. So they often really do want to slam down people hard as a deterrent. So people are spending time in jail. They are, for even small amounts of theft. But it's not just the impact that has on you. It's also the impact that it has on kids. And that does harm children. So when you harm your reputation, when you cast doubt on the schools, you harm children. Now, not only do you harm children, but you actually harm your co-workers by casting a shadow of doubt on all service personnel, and particularly all the people that you work with within your area. And let me give you some specific examples of how that can really work. Now, I don't really need to name the district, but I was working with a district recently, and they're certainly not unique. You have a large enough people. Again, we're talking small numbers of people who do the wrong thing, but enormous impact. We had a situation in this district. Some employees who are actually in supervisory roles in facilities had stolen supplies. The district had credit cards at a number of stores, and they were buying some pretty high-priced items, some nice hunting jackets and stuff, and charging it to the district. And this had actually been going on for a while, and they finally got caught. And so, of course, the employees were confronted, and they were forced to resign. At least in one of the cases, I believe they were prosecuted because it was excessive. It was a couple of employees who probably one had told the other they were doing it, and they decided to get on the bandwagon. But in any case, it was going on. And so the scandal broke. It hit the newspapers. And the first thing it did is it had enormous impact on the other supervisory employees within that department and within that school district, because all of a sudden, now people wondering how many other people had been doing this. Nobody else had been doing it. But there was all kinds of wonder about this, and they had an audit come in, so there was an awful lot of work that was involved in people having to pony up and prove that they had not done the same thing. And then the district imposed all kinds of new procedures on everyone in response to this. So everybody ended up with a whole lot of extra work as a result of the actions of a few individuals. So even though you had all these people, they were innocent, they had never done anything wrong, all of a sudden now their reputations are cast in doubt. Now they've got to prove that they weren't doing anything wrong, and now they've got to do all this additional extra paperwork, and in some cases additional burdens. Now, I'm not suggesting that in some cases it probably isn't a wise thing. I mean, we need to have systems and procedures in place to prevent bad behavior on the part of a few individuals. So sometimes things get lax when things are not done. But I will just give you a general opinion on this. The pendulum tends to swing too far the other way in response to a crisis, or in response to a scandal. So what will happen is, after the scandal, all of a sudden, now they've got these incredibly onerous, burdensome, and in some cases obstacles to efficiency procedures that have been put into place, both to build public confidence and to make sure absolutely this doesn't happen again. And in that process, it can actually be a hardship. Now, over time, things tend to settle back in to probably a new normal that is better than what we had before. But I want to suggest to you that that creates an enormous amount of harm to everybody within the organization. So I'll go back to, I had mentioned earlier about the scandal in my own state of New York, in which a superintendent and business official had stolen millions. So I have to tell you that in response to that, the state just created a whole new set of audit procedures. I can't even begin to tell you the amount of impact in terms of work it created on districts, and even cost to the state in ensuring that this was not happening anywhere else. And now, I will say I think some of that was a good thing, but from my perspective, as a consultant, it ended up creating some burdens, and I had never done anything wrong. So examples of that burdens were all kinds of additional disclaimer forms I needed to fill out, because some of the theft had involved pensions. So I had to do all kinds of disclaimer forms, and it's now close to a decade since that happened, and I'm still doing extra work, extra paperwork, extra justifications for things to prove that nothing is wrong. So this is often one of the most adverse consequences, is the impact that has on everybody else within a department. It can completely change procedures. And again, while I think some of those things probably are good things, because in some cases we had gotten lax, they often do swing too far the other way, because we really need to, once again, maintain the sense of public confidence. And that tends to maybe, for us, go a little overboard in the beginning, and that creates a lot of burden on other people. So the old saying that the bad create, situations that hurt the good, that's absolutely true. And that's true about everything. I mean, a lot of the things that we do is because of other people have done inappropriate, unethical things. So we have much more of a controls around overtime and biometrics and how you sign in districts and all this other kind of stuff that, we probably wouldn't need to have in place if we could confidently say that nobody is going to take advantage. But of course, what do we know is that while it's a few people, there are always going to be some people who will take advantage. So I ask people to be mindful of this. The more that we follow procedures as they exist, we do the ethical thing with response to what is the right thing, the less likely that we're going to end up having additional controls put in place. But you cannot control anyone else. So I want to delve a little bit more into this concept of trust. And I think all of us understand essentially what trust is, but I want to talk about trust in the context of trust of you, and trust in a department, and trust in an institution. What is the value of trust? Well, the essential value of trust is that when people trust you, they're not going to be looking so much at what you do. They assume that you know what you're doing. They have confidence in you. And in response to that confidence, for the most part, they leave you alone to get things done. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no rules about how things work, or it doesn't mean that if people have a concern about a particular issue, that they won't come out to express their views on it. But generally, when people have a lot of trust in a school district, they don't feel a particularly compelling need to come out to every meeting to make sure that everybody's doing the right thing. So that's kind of district-wide. When you look at it in terms of a department, it's the same thing. if you have a department that over time, has engendered significant amount of trust with central administration, then they're generally not asking a lot of questions about how things are being done other than the routine things. They're assuming you know what you're doing. And so you're not spending a lot of time having to justify what you do because the assumption is you have experience, they have confidence in you. And now we can take that down to the next level, confidence in an individual. So if you're a boss or supervisor and you have an employee and they're responsible for something, whether they're a bus driver or a para or a food service worker in the kitchen, and that employee over time has demonstrated that they are reliable, that they are expected, that they do what they're supposed to do correctly, then the supervisor generally doesn't feel that they have to spend a lot of time asking you questions about how things are going or looking up to check on work to make sure it was done correctly. And why? Because they have confidence. Confidence in the ability of the employee to do the right thing based on experience, their experience. And so this concept of confidence is a really important connection to trust. Because when I have confidence, I don't feel that I need to look. When I don't have confidence, then I need to look more, I need to ask more, etc. So one of the things that trust brings as a value is that people up above and the public doesn't feel the need to have explanations as to what we're doing. And so as a result, they tend to leave us alone. We get the benefit of being left alone. Success kind of works that same way too. So I, for example, was doing some work with the Postal Service at one point, actually on supervision. And at the time that I was doing the work with the Postal Service, we had various plants, and some of the plants they have metrics that they use in the Postal Service to determine the success of a plant. And they rank the plants from in each region, from say if there's 10 of them from 1 to 10. So if you happen to be number one plant in terms of the metrics of success, there's highly unlikely that you're going to have to answer a lot of questions about how you're doing things because the assumption is you must know what you're doing because you're getting it right. On the other hand, if you're 10th on the list, there's a very good chance that you're going to have to be explaining why you're at the bottom of the list. You're going to have to be writing memos and having action plans, etc. So one of the things that trust, which, could be connected to doing things right, being successful, is you get left alone. You get left alone. And beyond that, there's kind of another step in this. And that is a return on influence. So what do I mean by a return on influence? If you are an employee who is always tended to do the right thing and you get results, and in some positions it's harder to measure results, so you may not automatically get as much influence as in places where there's more objective examples of that. But as a general rule, the more trust that people have based on experience, the more likely they're going to be open to listening to ideas and suggestions from you. You build influence through trust. If I, for example, had a team of people working for me and they were involved in sales, we were at a meeting and I had my top salespeople who've always had great results for a while, and then I've had some of my weak players, and one of my top people has an idea or suggestion for sales, it's only natural I'm going to be more open to listening to that idea than I am from the person who is teetering, may not be successful. So the same thing is true on the work site. If I have workers whose work is subpar, I'm probably going to be less inclined to buy into their ideas about how to fix things or make things right than I am based on a top performer. Now, in some respects, it may be that the person who's a weaker performer, their idea is better, and ideas do have a life of their own. But as a general rule, it's only natural in life to be more likely to take advice from people who have built your confidence and trust. So one of the things that you gain through trust, and, we could define trust here in a lot of cases, depending on what your role is, but one example of trust is reliability on the work. The fact that if you're given a task to do, your supervisor reliably knows you're going to do it without needing to be told or without them needing to check. I've had supervisors talk about this concept of self-initiation. That is, that the employee doesn't wait to be told what to do. They have experience and they know what needs to be done, and they do it. And without me having to look, I'm confident that they're going to get the job done. Well, if I have a situation like that, where I have employees who have demonstrated that they do the right thing. For example, I have a bus driver. And as you know, bus drivers are responsible to do pre-trip inspections of their buses. And I have somebody who, every time I've ever looked, it's always done right. Their bus always looks clean. They've checked everything. I'm not finding out later that it wasn't done. Then over time, I'm going to be much more open to listening to the ideas of that person than I might be about somebody whose work is subpar, etc. So one of the benefits that you gain through trust is that you get left alone and you get a return on influence. So that's of great value. And that can easily be lost because of an absence of trust. And this is a truth. It's unfortunate. But it can take years to develop trust and seconds to destroy it. So I had a situation in a district in which this particular department had wonderful reputation. And then, as it turns out, that they had a scandal. There were some thefts among some employees. Now, as it turns out, the vast majority of the people in that department, again, as we've said over and over again, had never done anything wrong. But there were a couple of well-placed people who were stealing, and that came out. And immediately, the whole department lost its trust. The head person in the department, who had not done anything wrong, his leadership was put in doubt. And at some point, it even looked like his job might have been at risk. As it turns out, it wasn't. But his influence and the general trust of him was eroded significantly. And that happened after being there for a decade with a great track record. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't rebuild that trust. Obviously, a singular event is going to be taken in context, at least over time, so you can build back that trust as opposed to repeated examples of failing to demonstrate good practices, in which case people lose faith altogether. So it's not fatal. However, it takes a lot more time to build trust than to lose it. And so when we have people who are not doing the ethical things or cutting corners, they not only risk the trust of them, but in effect risk the trust of everyone around them and their department and the district as a whole. So it comes back to that basic or essential question of life, which is that life is about choices. Now, we talk a lot about that a lot with kids in schools these days, when we talk about making right choices and wrong choices, and that's really what it's about. Every single situation that you're confronted with in life is a matter of choice. You can either decide to take the high road or the low road, the road of the right way to do things or the road of the easy and the convenient road. And here's an irony. There are some people, I think you would expect that everybody would want to take the high road, and that people who take the low road, maybe they're doing it because they're lazy or etc. But I've actually noticed that there are a few people who really get off on this idea of taking the low road, getting over on the system. So I remember reading an article in the paper, and they were talking about, what people are proud of when they go home to their kids and what kinds of messages they sent. So they were talking about two types of employees. And they said, one employee is going to come home, and and this is a real example. We had a situation in a district where the fire sprinklers went off. They shouldn't have gone off. There was no fire. And it created a flooding situation. That flooding was risking flooding out actually the sprinkler went off in an office, but it was next door to a computer lab. And in that particular lab, they had computers that were on the floor. The CPUs were on the floor. And so what happened is, when this happened, the custodian in the building, very, very quick thinker, head custodian, and what he immediately did was he got a bunch of volunteers, and they quickly moved all of the computers off of the ground and onto the desks so that they wouldn't be destroyed by the water. In addition to saving the districts thousands of dollars, very important, they also did something equally as important, which was they made sure that those kids would have computers to work with the next day or two. Because had those computers been destroyed, that would have definitely limited kids' access to computers in that building for a while until they could have been replaced. They were probably insured, so they would have gotten an insurance claim, but it would have taken some time and it would have been disruptive of the instructional experience. So they saved that. So when that happened, he was lauded by the district for this. So I can imagine a person like that coming home to one of their family members, in fact, remembering this their whole life as a capstone event in their career, coming back and talking about how their quick thinking had saved the day and met the needs of kids. So that's one kind of person. Then you get another person who will come home and they'll say, the boss is away, I was able to leave 5 minutes early, no one's looking, I got away with this. And that's what they come home and talk about. So some people proudly talk about how they really did a great job, saved the day, or just did good work. And you get other people who very proudly talk about what they got away with, how they got over. And they're very proud of that. 'Cause what I find really interesting is that it takes intelligence to do both of these things. You know, you need to be a little smart, certainly at least in a common sense way, to be able to save the day. Or even to do the right thing takes smarts. You know, it also takes a bit of smarts to do the wrong thing. Because you have to know how the system works and how you can play that system. So this isn't really a question of intelligence. It's a question of values. Do you value being a good employee, or do you value being somebody who gets over on the system? And we do have people who are very proud of the fact that they've learned how to play the system, do bare minimum. And so that also is a question of ethics. You know, whether or not you take pride in doing good work, or whether you take pride in doing the minimum you have to do in order to be able to get away with things. A person makes a choice. You can either choose to commit to being the best employee, or you can actually choose to commit to being the worst employee and get away with it. And we do have people who quite frankly, they know they're the worst employee. They know how to just stay within that fine line that won't allow them to be removed. Just that bare minimum they have to do where they won't get fired. And they're quite proud of that because as far as they're concerned, they're getting paid and they can do bare minimum. And you get other people who say, no, I always want to be better at what I do. What I do is important. I value it. And I want to be the best at it. And when I say best, it's not in an arrogant way. You're not going to walk around saying, I'm the best para. You don't have to do that. But in your own mind, you're striving to be better and better at what you do. And every one of us can be better and better at what we do all the time. Perfection is the enemy of excellence in life. Excellence comes from a commitment to constantly asking the question, is there a better way? Could I be more effective? So that's a choice, and some choose the other. What is the absolute minimum I can do that's going to stay just below my boss's radar screen or won't get me fired? That's the kind of ethical choice that employees have to make. And here's, again, a really important key piece of this. We know that, part of the control of positive behavior in all of life, whether it's how fast you go on the road or what people do, is because there are deterrents built in. We have laws, we have state troopers. In my state, they now have cameras in some cases where people are actually getting tickets from cameras. I don't know whether they're doing that in West Virginia yet, but we have all of those things in place. So those are deterrents that are external deterrents. A person doesn't want to speed because they might get caught, or they don't want to steal because there might be a camera, or they might get arrested. But a lot of people don't need to rely on those things. They are willing to do the right thing when no one is watching because they have some sense of what right and wrong is. And that, to me, is a real sense of integrity. We don't, it's not that we follow rules simply because we think we're going to get caught or we're going to get a ticket. We follow rules because we really, that's part of our personal integrity in doing the right things. And again, this ties in with this notion of trust. If I'm a supervisor and I know that I have people who will only do the right thing if I'm watching, then I have to constantly be watching them and checking. If I have people who I know have integrity and will do the right thing even when no one is looking, then over time, based on that experience, I don't have to look. Once I've built the confidence, I don't need to be looking and checking and inspecting and finding out. I know that they will do the right thing when no one is watching. That builds the benefit for the person who has integrity because they don't have to justify or explain what they have to do. By the way, I want to just address an issue. A lot of times we have employees who will not do the right thing. And again, I keep wanting to emphasize they're the few rather than the many. Most people have integrity. But I have some people, who don't do the right things unless someone's really checking. And then, even then, they moan about it. So let's say I have an employee that, as a general rule, when the cat's away, the mice will play. When no one's looking, they're cutting corners. And so I, as a result, as a supervisor, are now needing to check on them a lot more. And the first thing they're going to say is, well, you're picking on me. How come you're not checking on everyone else? Well, the reason why the supervisor's not checking on everyone else, is that they have confidence in those people. So they don't need to check on them. So this notion that we, even as in a supervisory role, that we should be checking on everybody the same is incorrect. We should base what we check on our confidence. Now, early in my career, technically, officially, it never really changed being this, but I was an accountant and an auditor. And one of the things that you learn in auditing is, I'll give you kind of a quick 1 minute on what auditing is about, because I think this is an important idea, because auditing is about checking and confidence. So in auditing, what you'll do is you'll look at any system, any set of procedures. Could be how we mop floors, could be how we pay a bill, could be procedures for how buses are supposed to do their routes. It could be anything. So first thing you do is you document that system. How is it supposed to work? If it's working correctly, what's it's supposed to look like, and to make sure that there in fact is a system, because in some cases there's a lack of clarity about what system is. But let's assume there is a system or procedure in place, whether it's locally developed or it's actually been developed by virtue of state or federal regulations. Nevertheless, we have that system. And then the second thing you do, after you document how it's supposed to work, is you test it. So in the case of doing, say, a financial test, if there are certain procedures that need to take place before you can give somebody a check, you go in and you check, you audit, which means you basically look and say, was the paperwork right? Did the person check the math, etc. If you were doing an audit, buses, you might go on a run or two, or check on if you have GPSs in buses, check to make sure that in fact the bus is following the route. You're testing the system. Whether you test it indirectly or otherwise, you're testing it, Let's assume that you have the system in place and you do some random checks. You look at every 100th check. And you see that in each case of all the 100 checks, every time all the paperwork was correct. All of the forms were filled out correctly. Everything was done right. Well, if you've randomly checked, I'm not going to get to how many you have to do, but let's say you randomly checked a dozen or so of these transactions, these events, over, say, 1,000 events. And in each case where you checked, everything was right. You probably can have a high degree of confidence, given the fact that you selected randomly, that all of the events are correct. Barring an error or two here or there. But you can have a high level of confidence that's being done correctly. But let's say you come in and you select a dozen or so items and none of them are correct or half of them are correct, then you don't have confidence. So at that point, you don't really know what's going on. So the only way you really can check is to expand how much you look. In fact, if you looked at all 12 and they were all wrong, you probably would have to look at every transaction to find out exactly what was happening. And the same thing applies to an employee. If I have an employee and as part of their, say, a checklist for things they have to do as a custodian, and I go and I just randomly check to see if those things have been done. Like, for example, did they remove dust from reflectors, lighting reflectors? And in each case, with this particular employee, every time I checked, say over a year, it had been done. So I can probably confidently say that they're doing it all the time. On the other hand, if I had another employee and I, again, randomly checked to see what was going on, and in half the cases or in all of the cases it hadn't been done, then I can probably conclude this employee isn't doing it, and the only way that I can actually make sure it ever got done is if I constantly looked. So the employee where when I looked randomly a dozen or so times and each time was done right, I probably don't have to look at that again. I can move on with confidence that's being done. On the other hand, if I've got somebody in that constantly things are wrong, then the only way I can be sure is if I'm looking at them more. So I'm naturally going to be going to the person who I don't have confidence from. So not that I'm picking on the person who does the poor work, I'm focusing on the work. It has nothing to do with whether I like the person or not, or respect them as a person. It's irrelevant. I can't have confidence that they're fixing this item if I've randomly checked and it wasn't done. When you don't have integrity and you don't do things, even when no one's watching, eventually that's going to drop out and you're going to have someone watching more. Because that's the only way they can really deal with this situation, is to watch more. Higher confidence, less need to check on the person. Lower confidence, more need to check. And again, we've talked about the benefits of that. You don't have to spend your time justifying. Not to mention that you can take pride in your work, which is an important piece as well. And just as a kind of a summary on this, in the absence of trust hurts all of us. It doesn't just hurt the employee. It hurts those associated with the person, because if we're part of a team, I'm working in the kitchen and one person is not cognizant of food safety and we have some sort of an issue, and it has happened in kitchens. We have situations where some people have not followed proper procedure, and as a result, we have a number of people getting ill. Fortunately, not fatally ill, but getting ill. And all of a sudden, now it casts doubt on everybody in the department. And now we're doing over checking to make sure that we're not having any cross contamination. So that would be an example, and certainly there are others. It hurts the institution if this thing hits the paper. We may have, I've worked with a district, they'll have 20 kitchens. Like, as you know, in much of the South, we have countywide schools. So I have worked with districts, they're extremely large, especially a few of the districts in Florida. And they could sometimes have 100 buildings, 100 kitchens they're running. In some of these cases, we might have had a foodborne illness problem in one school. And yet, that will hit the papers, and now that we've got parents in every school concerned about whether or not their kids are getting safe meals. And all of a sudden now everybody's got to justify their procedures and tighten up things and new procedures. So it can damage a whole institution because of what's happening in one particular place under, say, the leadership of one particular leader, or under, in some cases, one single employee not doing the right things. And along the lines with that, it hurts the institution by adding additional costs, because control involves costs. When you set up new controls in order to try to rebuild public confidence that maybe are overdone, but it's the normal reaction, or you have to have now inspections of every kitchen. We've had situations where, in response to one theft, the district spent thousands and thousands of dollars to hire what they call forensic audits. Forensic generally would mean like you're looking at something that went wrong, as opposed to what normal audits are, which is just to check reliability. So it's usually forensic audit is done when there's a suspicion of theft. We had a situation of suspicion of theft, and now they do a forensic audit of the whole district. It costs the district $100,000 to do this in order to make sure that there's no other thefts. That was a cost that wouldn't have been necessary if we'd never had the theft. In some cases, the audits cost more than the theft itself, but we have to do it because it's the only way we can make sure that the theft isn't more widespread. So you have additional costs, and that money comes from somewhere. That's computers we're not buying for kids. That's stuff we're not doing for children. It has a real impact. And then it hurts stakeholders who lose confidence, and ultimately it hurts children. And that's where we all want to go back with all of this. In the end, when employees do the wrong things, it may be a less direct route, but even an employee who has no contact with children, like someone working in a business office, can hurt children by their actions if they do an unethical thing. What's really interesting is that lots of people who are dishonest don't see themselves that way. Our prisons are full of people that think that someone else's fault that they're in prison. It's the rare criminal who actually thinks they're not a person of high ethical value. What they do is they have justifications for their actions. And people have an amazing ability to justify. Everybody does it, lots of different justifications. Some of the most dishonest people think of themselves as quite honest. By the way, it's very funny. I was reading a book once, and they said, if you're in a business transaction with someone, always be suspicious of the person who's constantly talking about how ethical they are and how honest they are, because they'll rob you blind. Because really honest people don't need to talk about how honest they are. They just do it. The fact that the person's fixating on it probably means that they're conning you. Here are some of the rationalizations that you commonly hear from people who are not doing the right things. No harm was done. Like, for example, when they get caught doing something wrong, well, no one got hurt. Or cutting corners. Everybody does it. Everybody does it. It was legal. What I did was legal, even though it was wrong. One that people don't generally say this way, but I'm entitled. And examples of entitled would be, well, if you're convinced that like everybody's making more money than you, then therefore you're entitled to steal some of it because, or steal some food from the kitchen because after all, the boss, the superintendent makes so much money and the mayor makes so much money. So therefore, I can take home food. Even in some cases I've heard in food service, well, it would have gotten thrown out anyway, even though the law is quite clear about that. So there you have an example where it's illegal to do. So people have an amazing way to justify and rationalize their bad behavior. I do believe that in their heart they know it's still wrong, but people find ways of kind of, they assuage this sense of guilt by finding excuses, and those excuses are driving their actions. What I try to emphasize with employees, and unfortunately people realize this unethical people tend to realize this after the fact, but every time you make an unethical decision, you're rolling the dice on your life. You are. Because your integrity and reputation count a lot. They count a lot for you. And I have seen even small incidents literally ruin a person's life. And so what do I mean? You have a person, they have a nice pension, they have a nice job, they're well respected in the community, they're well respected by their family. And all of a sudden, they do something that's wrong. And they get caught. And all of a sudden, they're fired. So they don't have a job. And, when you've been fired for a theft that's been well publicized, kind of hard to find another job. Certainly limits your choices. In some cases, depending on how severe, they may lose their pension. So that could be significant. Everyone's going to know about it, especially if you steal from a public sector institution or you do something significantly wrong. There's a very good chance it's going to make the papers. And in small communities, people are going to know about it. Your family's going to know about it. Your friends are going to know about it. While people make mistakes, and we do believe in forgiveness, it can have a significant impact. It could change your life in an instant. What I ask people to think about is, what impact would it have on your family if you were caught? Just imagine this. You have some, we work so hard to raise our kids and to build a family. And so we have two kids who love and respect their parents, and now you've gotten a parent that's now been caught stealing from the schools, or have been caught doing the wrong thing that resulted in an injury to a child or from people getting sick. So how are you going to go home and explain to your children what happened? Well, I'm sure that they will forgive you, because we tend to love the people we love, not expecting them to be perfect. But just imagine the impact on them, the emotional impact on them. Is it really worth it? Is it worth the risk? Now, sure, most people feel they'll never get caught, so therefore the risk seems remote. But people get caught all the time. Things happen. You cut corners. People do get injured. You steal even a little, or supplies, and you do sometimes get caught. And people are getting caught more and more, because as we've done more because of school safety, there's more cameras, there's more eyes looking. And so I know some people that are really shocked when all of a sudden they're now getting a little knock on the door from the local police because of something that was seen on a district camera, like stealing supplies from the office. And all of a sudden now, and I'm not saying in every case they prosecute, but just imagine that they do. What kind of an impact is that going to have on your life, on your relationship with your family? It could be devastating, and has been devastating to people. And afterwards they have enormous regret. Why did I do that over that little thing? Well, it may have been a little thing to you, but it's a big impact if you get caught. And people do get caught. Not everybody, but some. And that could be you. Now, the interesting thing that we've observed a lot with, people who steal is that most people don't decide to steal big right away. In fact, in most of the really well-placed thefts, these took place over a period of time, and they started small. They were like a slippery slope. Because with each step that you take, it seems so much easier to see the next step as not being that far a reach. So the example I always give is the person who steals nails doesn't find it that hard then to say, I'll steal hammers. Once you're starting to steal hammers, it's not a really big leap to say, I'll steal power tools. And so the person who's stealing a power tool then says, well, I can steal the building materials too. So we've seen the same thing in a business office. Someone will steal a small amount of money and they get away with it. Maybe they get away with it for a period of time, and then they up the ante, and they keep upping the ante. And by the way, each time you up the ante, not only are you doing a much more severe theft, but you're also increasing the risk and probability of you being caught. So rarely does a person just one morning wake up and say, I'm going to steal $10,000, or I'm going to steal hundreds of dollars even from a district. Usually started out with small actions. And the same thing can be said for cutting corners on the job. A lot of times a person will break a few minor rules and they don't get caught, and they don't get, they get away with it. And that only then kind of makes them more brazen in their willingness to then be willing to maybe stretch a few or break a few more rules. And eventually, as you get more and more brazen, your potential to get caught increases. And you do get caught. That's what happens in all too many cases, and you wonder how you got from where you started to where you are. Something that was so completely alien a concept in the beginning. It's the slippery slope. So here's a really interesting question. So what is the thing most often stolen in school districts? So I'll give you a moment to ponder about that. If you're together in groups, I'd like you to maybe take a minute to discuss it. And we'll see if you get it right. If you're by yourself, you can take a quick guess. So I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds to think about this. Okay, we're back. So, what is the most stolen things in districts? And the answer is time. Time is the most stolen thing in districts. So what do I mean? There's this concept of a good day's pay for a good day's work. And we have employees who are constantly, and again, I keep reiterating this over and over again, it's some. not everyone, but we have employees who cheat on time all the time. And there are lots of different ways you can cheat on time. So let's start with just a basic concept about time. And I don't want to be absolute about this because districts have kind of slightly different standards on this, but the basic idea and expectation is that you get paid for working. And so what does that mean? That when you clock in or check in, you should be checking in ready to work. And we have some, and a lot of employees do that, but we have some employees who think, checking in and then I can warm up for half an hour. I was working in a particular district, and this was second shift with the facilities department, and we had people, they would clock in, grab a cup of coffee, have a little conversation for 15, 20 minutes, sort their CDs, because these people work at night, so they tend to play music, decide on their selection list for the evening, and arrive actually to start work as late as half an hour or 25 minutes after the start of their shift. That's stealing time. I've talked to supervisors about this. Some, especially for good workers, some expectation that, there's some setting up time. You're going to clock in, get in your uniform. And, 5 or 10 minutes we can understand. But when a person's taking a half an hour to get ready to work, that's a problem. And then we get people, their break is supposed to be 15 minutes, but, it's now like 20, 25 minutes. That's stealing time. I had one district where there was a 40-minute lunch hour. That's the contract lunch hour, and it's part of their contract that they negotiated. The employees had come to interpret this as, well, it's 40 minutes from the time I bring back my lunch. So they would go out to the local place, grab their lunch. That would take a half an hour, and then when they got back, they'd take 40 minutes to eat it. So it wasn't a 40-minute lunch hour. It's more like an hour and 15-minute lunch hour. And also, some winding down at the end of the day. I had, and I'm seeing less and less of this as smoking's become a little bit less prevalent today. And that's a good thing, of course, for people's health. But I remember in the old days, we'd have people at 15 minutes before the end of their day, they'd already have the cigarette and the lighter in their hand, and they weren't doing any work. They were winding down. So, you start to have the cumulative effect of this. Say this is all the same person, and sometimes it is. So that person is taking a half an hour to warm up. They're taking 25-minute breaks instead of 20 minutes. They got this little wiggle room on lunch where it's supposed to be 40 minutes, but it's really now about an hour and 10 minutes. And then they're doing the same thing in the break in the afternoon, and they're doing the same thing in the evening. So now let's start to add that up. So we got a half an hour in the morning. We've got about a half an hour, about 5 minutes or 10 minutes at the first break. That's already 40 minutes. And then you got another half an hour at lunch. That's 70 minutes. Another 10 minutes for the break in the afternoon. That's 80 minutes. And then they're winding down 15 minutes early at the end of the day. That's 95 minutes. That's about an hour and a half of each day that they're not working. And then they're complaining that we need overtime to get the work done. So stealing time for a lot of people doesn't appear to be stealing, but it really is. And most people are not going to get arrested for this. But we have much more tightening of procedures because we have some people who take advantage of time situations. Now, I will say, depending on the nature of the work, sometimes how you do the work may be more important than how many minutes you spend, because we have people that don't do that, and they just slow workers, and and they're always there, but they don't do a very good job. And you have some people that are, they probably are not as exacting about this, but they make it up in terms of their initiative in getting the work done. So I'm not suggesting it's the only thing that matters, but in a lot of cases it really does matter, because in some cases the job has coverage issues. So, for example, we have people doing this in the office. They were warming up to get ready. They were office workers. They would clock in, and they weren't at their desks at the start of the day, and the phones are ringing. People are calling up, and there's no one to answer the phone. People need to be mindful that ready to work is ready to work. And that's what you should be at the start of a shift. If you need time to warm up, you need to arrive earlier. Now, just like there's a slippery slope, we talked about the hammer, the nails to the hammer, there's another kind of slippery slope that happens with people too. And that is, if a person's willing to break one kind of rule, how do I know they won't break another kind of rule? So the person who will steal time, they're just a little bit of a step away from cutting corners in terms of procedures that may involve safety. And we're going to talk for a minute about where safety fits in. It's one of the last slides I have. But just this notion of once you open the door to thinking of rules as malleable, bendable, stretchable, then what's to stop you from stretching other rules? And it's usually that kind of a slippery slope that often causes not so much thefts, but real dangers in which people are cutting corners in a way that could have a serious effect on health, safety, and welfare of kids and adults in the building. And again, I want to just reiterate this, what value do you place in your reputation? Remember they used to have those commercials for, I think it was for Visa or MasterCard, where they would talk about things being priceless. Having such a high value, you cannot put a price on them. So one of the questions I would ask is, what's the value of your reputation, and what happens when that reputation gets eroded? Now, here we're not necessarily talking about stealing. We're talking about something else, which is stealing or even cutting corners. It's people really having trust that what you say is true. So, for example, if I come to an employee and I say, did you take care of that? Did you do that properly? And they tell me, yes, I did. Did you check all the circuit breakers? Did you do this? And the person says yes. And then I discover that they did not do that. They did not follow that procedure. Then I begin to lose confidence in them. I have had situations where people who have lied on their job application, that's how they're establishing themselves when they first begin. And then they wonder why, when they get caught, when someone does the references, they decide not to hire them based on small fibbing on their resume. And what I'm going to say about this is this. If I'm beginning my relationship with you by you already lying to me, how do I know that you won't continue to lie to me over and over again? So it isn't so much the nature of what you lied about, but the fact that your word doesn't mean anything. And so I say to employees all the time, if you've made a mistake, you need to tell me, especially in the safety area. I can forgive you for making mistakes. We all make mistakes. But if you cover it up or you lie about it and I find out, then I have to wonder if I can ever trust you again about anything. And what does that really mean in terms of my relationship with you in the workplace? So to ask yourself, is it worth it? Is it worth the risk? Given all of the things we've talked about here, I would say no, it's not worth the risk. And just as a matter of wrap-up, let me just say this. The reason why most people do the right thing is because they feel better about themselves when they do the right things. Being ethical, doing the right thing, makes you feel good. It will make you happy. At the end of your career, you can come away saying, I did good work. I'm proud of my work. I made a difference. And so there's enormous value in that. So if as I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this, you're the people who are ethical, I want you to feel good about that. And if you've made some poor choices in the past, I want you to rethink it. Because each day is another opportunity to have a chance to do the right thing and make those right choices. And we hope that moving forward, you'll make them. So whether you've always made them or in the future you're going to make them, I think what you're going to find is that's going to make you a happier person, a more satisfied person, a more valued person on the workplace. And that's just of enormous benefit to you. So I want to thank you again for participating in this online session. Certainly, if you have any questions, you can contact us or talk to your supervisor. And have a wonderful day.